Okay, welcome to today's lesson on although, though and even though. Now all three of these words and another word, while as well, which we will talk about a little bit today, they are involved in something called concession. And we're going to compare concession and contrast because they are actually different and we use different words for concession and for contrast. So when you concede a point, very often you are comparing a negative thing with a positive thing. And this is called concession, where you admit something, where you allow something. So have a look at this example. Although the restaurant was very expensive, the food was delicious. I am conceding that although it was expensive, it was actually really tasty food. So I'm comparing a positive thing and a negative thing, expensive and delicious. Really, those two adjectives are being compared, expensive and delicious. And this is concession. This is not bare contrast. A bare contrast is where you contrast two opposites, let's say. Yeah, something like he lives in the north of the country, whereas I live in the south. And notice I use whereas for direct contrast and not although. You can't say he lives in the north of the country, although I live in the south. Or it sounds a little bit strange because although is for concession, whereas or while is for contrast. Okay, so these three words are subordinating conjunctions, and that's important. That means that they are always followed by a clause, apart from these situations that we'll talk about in a minute. But then they must be followed by a clause, and they're followed by a clause and they're joined onto a main clause. Yeah, so here's the clause, although the restaurant was very expensive. That's our subordinate clause, and that must be joined onto a main clause. You can't put a full stop there. If you put a full stop there, it's a fragment. Okay, it's just a subordinate clause. It's not enough to stand on its own. It needs the main clause. Although the restaurant was very expensive, the food was delicious. Okay, so all three of these can be used in place here. You can say though the restaurant was very expensive, or even though the restaurant was very expensive, or even while the restaurant was very expensive, because we do use while for concession, but only if we start the sentence with while. You couldn't do it here. Yeah, you can say the food was delicious, although the restaurant was very expensive. You can say the food was delicious, though the restaurant was very expensive, even though the restaurant was very expensive. But you can't really change it with